Hello, everyone. All right, while I try to make sense of how I'm going to finish this in half an hour, welcome along to my session. I am Dr. Rashina Hoda from the University of Auckland in New Zealand. So needless to say, it was a really, really long flight, but worth it. All right, these are lovely sponsors. Kia ora, as they say, greetings from New Zealand. I'll just give you and sort of make you envious with a few luscious green, the general, scenery from New Zealand. So that's us way in the corner right over there, far, far away. That's kind of what it looks like on a nice day. I know, eh? That's Auckland. And we don't have as much, like our sort of skyline isn't as high as Dubai, but we have a skyline. Our skylines are probably more defined by the mountains, I guess. That's the University of Auckland, the business school in particular, which we like to flaunt everywhere. And that there is a piece of old architecture, our clock tower. So we have got the old and the new. All right, so getting straight onto it, today's topic, which is self-organizing teams. I'll start by talking about whether or not this is a new concept, okay? So I'll just give you a taste of where this has come from, or where are different sources this idea has come from. So as part of my PhD study, which seems like now and ages ago, I went and looked at self-organization not just from a software engineering perspective, but also from various other sources. And in doing that, I found that it's really not a new concept. It's come from a lot of different fields and disciplines. So going as far back as the 1950s from the socio-technical systems perspective, you find it mentioned in the organizational theory ideas in 1980s. You find it mentioned in knowledge management discipline again in the 1980s. And in the 1990s, a very different take on it is from the perspective of complex adaptive systems. And then finally in software development in 1990s with, of course, Agile. So I'll run you through these very quickly. The ones in the 1950s, the socio-technical system actually dates back to the study of English coal miners, okay? And yeah, I know, talk about origins. But they were described as self-managing groups, all right? And the description that you see here in the 1950s, this is from a paper by Trist in 1981, is hauntingly familiar or similar to what we today call an agile team. This is really, really sort of goosebumps for me when I was doing this. So that's 10 to 15 cross-trained people setting their own work schedules. They're autonomous. They learn on an everyday basis. They assume the responsibilities of what used to be the responsibilities of their supervisors formerly, but now they take that on themselves. They're guided by the corporate vision, so they always have that organizational vision in mind, and they're motivated by peer pressure, not as much by management. Now, if that doesn't sound like Agile, I don't know what does. So this is 1981, folks. All right, next you find it mentioned again in the idea of holographic brains. Now, I'm not going to go into the details of what that means, but I'm going to filter that down to what it means to us. It basically means that this guy, Morgan, in this book, Images of Organizations, 1986, described a certain kind of organization which is the perfect context for self-organizing teams. And he laid down 4 principles for self-organization. And these are minimum critical specification. So I'll bring it down into layman terms, which basically means no manager is telling me what to do. They only give me this minimum required information to do my task. They do not micromanage me. Okay. The next one is requisite variety, and what that means is, okay, as a team, I am dealing with a number of different technologies, a number of different customer demands. In my team, I have enough variety to deal with all of those variety of requests. That's kind of what that means. Redundancy of function, that's pretty obvious. What that means is I'm not the only person on the team who can do this. Should I be sick, as I have been for a couple of days. You don't know my regular voice, so this is kind of funny. I'm sounding funny to myself, probably not to you. So someone else can take my place, right? And work can go on. And finally, double loop learning, which is to say I don't just work, I actually think about how I work and how I can improve it, right? So again, this is like, to me, it was like, whoa, we're applying all of this in Agile today, right? The next one is probably what the Agile community is more familiar with, is the very, very famous, the new product development game paper in the Harvard Business Review by Takeuchi and Nonaka. How many people know of this? Yes, indeed. So 1986, and this is actually the origin of Scrum. Interestingly, the word Scrum in this paper is mentioned all of about one time, right? But they stuck with it, and that's what they called it. So in here, Takeuchi and Nonaka laid the foundations of the conditions for self-organization. What do you need for self-organizing teams to flourish? And what they talk about is autonomy, of course, you give them the freedom to do stuff. Cross-fertilization, which is again related to the redundancy thing I talked about, right? You're sort of not specialists or not just specialists, you're able to do at least a few other things. And then self-transcendence, which kind of sounds like a yoga term, but it isn't. What really means is that you're constantly working to get better and better and better, all right? So again, these are the sort of foundations of where we're coming from. All right, this is the odd one out for me, but really interesting. As I said, the complex adaptive systems perspective to self-organization. And that's coming from the idea of ant colonies and the study of human cities and ecosystems and how the birds, I mean, we've all seen this, right? How birds swarm around into formations and things like that from a very biological sort of perspective. But they also define the characteristics of self-organizing teams. And that's, for example, things like they're informal and temporary. So think about a swarm of birds. They're quite informal, they're temporary, they're spontaneously formed around issues, right? So they needed to take a certain path, they changed the formation, yes? Informal structure, it's not like someone actually is, in charge or permanently in charge. Strong sense of shared purpose, they all have the same common goal, and they decide their own affairs. And again, if you're able to take that leap from birds and ants and bees, you will find similarities in the way software teams work now, or we're supposed to work in an Agile system, all right? So I've got citations here for people who are more interested. And finally, in the 1990s, you find the idea of self-organization being introduced to Agile software development through the Agile Manifesto, right? So in the principles of the Agile Manifesto, not the 4 values, but the 12 principles, one of the last ones there is the source of best architecture requirements and design is the self-organizing team, right? And that's one of the first mentions of the word in software engineering. It's often been cited as a critical success factor, and it is specifically referred to as self-organizing teams in Scrum, and empowered teams is what they call it in XP. And the way it is described in the Agile literature most of the time is again quite similar. Cross-functional team members, they have a common focus, they self-manage their workload, they have a collaborative decision-making process, and they continuously learn. So I know this is quite quick because I'm keenly aware of the time, but you will see hopefully some of the similarities between what I mentioned from 1950s to 80s to this one here, right? Yes? Yes. Excellent, students. All right, so does being Agile automatically make you self-organizing? That's the most interesting question to me, okay? And so the question out to you is, do Agile practices enable self-organization in Agile teams? What would you say? Yes? Okay, how many people say yes? 2 people, 3 people. Everybody else is a no, or you can't make up your mind? Is it a no?
Yeah, I think it's no.
Okay. All right. I would argue, and it's my perspective, that they have the ability to enable it, right? I'm not talking about practice, I'm talking about theory. All right? So theoretically, they're geared towards allowing you to become self-organizing, all right? Now, so this was fun, let's do some more. Myth or fact? Do Agile practices enable self-organization in Agile teams? We answered Yes, theoretically, yes. Are Agile teams meant to be self-organizing? If you go by the manifesto, yes. Because that's again the theoretical foundations. Yes. You differ?
Yeah, but there's one thing. By the normal laws of having any team together, you have the four stages of any team, where you start by building the teams and storming, the norming, and following on. So basically, even if you build a Agile team, which is from functional aspects, empowered everything, they will start by storming at the second stage. So do not expect that they will be self-organizing all of a sudden.
Yeah.
It needs some common goal, and it will go through that stage.
Good point. So what my friend here is pointing out is that it's not an instant conversion process, right? It's like, all right, we start doing Agile, we are self-organizing. That doesn't happen, and you're absolutely right. So what I'm trying to get to here is, are they meant to be self-organizing? Again, we're talking about the intention there. At the end of the day, would you expect a team that has taken on Agile as their methodology to become self-organizing somewhere down the line? And yes? Okay.
So are you indicating that when we have Agile, we have self-organizing teams, there is no need for team leader?
I am not even getting there yet. Those are the more interesting questions, but we're not getting there yet. So just hold your horses. Are all Agile teams self-organizing? It kind of goes back to what my friend said about where you are in the process. Yes? So you may not be at all if you're right at the beginning, and if you're used to working in a traditional environment and we just suddenly started using Agile. The practices of Agile, the concrete practices of Scrum, whether it's release planning or it's the daily stand-up, those are the easier bits, right? You learn about them, you start doing them, right? Yes, there are challenges in sort of adhering to practice and being on time and whatnot, but the more difficult part is the attitude change to become self-organizing and not be manager-led, right? So that's where, again, I'm going to go for no, right? Because all Agile teams are not. They're on a journey, as you said, and you're at various points in the process.
May I ask you a question, just very quickly?
Yep.
Do you consider the team leader part of the team or not?
The team leader, so everyone has a different definition. Are you talking about someone who's hands-on development? Or are you talking more about the Scrum Master?
The team composition. When you say team, self-organizing teams,
Yep.
teams.
Yep.
Do you count the team leader as part of the team or not?
All right, so
because this will define what we're saying about self-organizing, because if we acknowledge the role of a team leader as part of the team, and the team are organizing themselves in the presence of the leader, acknowledging the role of leadership, then there's no argument.
Right. So there's no simple answer. I will go with what Scrum says, where the team is separate from the Scrum Master, if that's what you mean. Some teams will still have team leaders and technical leads and whatnot, but ideally you're supposed to be, the hierarchy is supposed to be flat within the team. Again, that's ideally, right? And again, we're talking about this continuum of going from here, where it's rather hierarchical. You've got the leader, you might have a sort of technical lead under them, you've got junior developers and so forth, to moving towards a hierarchy where you have a Scrum Master who's more like a rugby coach on the sidelines, and the Scrum team is the one that's actually performing, and it's flat. Quite ideal case. It does happen. I have seen it happen. Most of the other people are somewhere in between in the process. And that's been my experience. I do industrial research. So I actually go out into the companies and talk to people and look at their practices. So I've found the whole spectrum, right? But when you do get the ideal, it's absolutely beautiful. It's like, whoa, I want to document that. But it takes years of practice. Absolutely, doesn't come easy. So by team, I mean the actual development team. I'm not counting the people like the Scrum Master or the product owner, or people who are more part of the management layer. Kind of separate that. Okay. So can non-Agile teams be self-organizing? It gets getting trickier and trickier. Yes. Okay. So in other words, the idea of self-organization is not unique to Agile. All right. It comes with it, but it's not unique to Agile. So I would agree as well. Here's another googly. Can waterfall teams be self-organizing? I'll let you munch on that. I'm not going to answer that. We can have a discussion afterwards. Yes?
There is the feedback waterfall model could be self-organizing. There's two versions of waterfall.
That's right.
One and the feeding guy.
That's right. Poor old Ross, bless his soul, he meant it to be iterative, but no one took it to be iterative with waterfall, and they actually adopted the sequential version, which is what is more common. So yeah, as I said, that's discussion over tea. But in the meanwhile, this is kind of how I define it based on the research that I've done over the years. Agile teams are self-organizing when, and you will see it starts off with enabling conditions, which is that they are given a high level of autonomy. That's kind of where it starts. You can't expect to have, take your best programmers, 10 or 12, shove them in a room, leave them alone and say, be self-organizing, right? You have to create the conditions for it, and you have to help enable them to do it. They commit to select and accomplish their own tasks. Again, that's for me, one of the more sort of hallmark features of a team that's closer to the other end of self-organization. If you're highly self-organizing, you're probably selecting your own tasks, selecting your own goals, okay? They organize themselves as needed, and they perform certain roles. And that really is what I'm going to dig into today in this talk. It's talk about the roles that people perform to organize themselves. And they perform balancing acts between the freedom that they're given, but they have to have the responsibility for it. You just can't, go around and do whatever you wanted. You have to have cross-functionality, but in my research, what I've found is you cannot do with completely leaving off specialization. You need your specialists sometimes, okay? Continuous learning, and that's the, we all talk about let's always, continue to learn, but the real challenge there is how do you do it when your iterations are 2 weeks and you have 50 points to cover? When do you learn, right? So these are the balancing acts that people perform. That's for some other time in some other world. Today I'm going to be focusing on the roles. So the research findings. So what I'm about to talk about today is based on an original industry-based PhD research where I talked to about 58 Agile practitioners, personally face-to-face from 23 different organizations in New Zealand, India, and North America. These were semi-structured interviews, and some observations of the practices actually went out into the companies who were really generous to have me over and look over how they do things and talk to them. And I collected multiple perspectives. So I just didn't talk to the developers or just didn't talk to the product owners. In fact, by the end of my PhD, I had talked to everyone from the CEO to pretty much the janitor. Essentially, seriously, I really wanted to get a whole, view of this instead of a high-level management view of how this thing goes, right? So I talked to everyone. And the most common sort of methodology that people were using was a combination of Scrum and XP. Which is not surprising. The research method, I realize most practitioners here, so I'm not going to go into too much detail. It's a method called grounded theory, and it focuses on trying to get the sort of common patterns, if you like, from talking to a whole bunch of people, and what's the most important thing that is relevant to everybody, okay? So I don't go out with a hypothesis trying to prove it right or wrong. Instead, I let the most interesting things emerge from the data. So this is very different methodology than what we call the scientific method, where you have a hypothesis and you're trying to prove it right or wrong. I did not have a hypothesis. I was like a curious bunny trying to find out how things work around here. That's kind of how it worked. And that there is the diagram for my academic friends. I'm happy to discuss more at some other time. But it essentially involves different levels of or phases of data collection and coding and analysis and sorting, and then the final write-up. Okay. I have a few papers. One of them is particularly devoted to explaining how the methodology works for those who are interested. All right, so these are the demographics of the people that I talked about, the 58 people. Positions, as you can see, this is Agile Coach, senior management, developers, business analysts, testers, sales managers, you can see the whole lot, right? As I said, the most common was Scrum and XP. The organizations varied from medium, large. This is from 10 people companies to 100,000. I obviously didn't talk to all of them, thank goodness. But most of them were in New Zealand and India, and a few from Canada and the US. And the domains, again, were really varied. So there were health, IT, transport, what have you. The team sizes again varied quite a bit. You've got, I think, as small as 2 somewhere maybe, or 4 is the smallest, and then 10 to 15, and sometimes it was variable. The projects were really quite small, 3 to 6 months kind of things, to really large projects where that's just ongoing for several years. Because we know that, it's not like a boutique thing, Agile. Everyone wants to use it and can't stop them, right? And the iterations were as small as like a week to as most frequently 2 to 4 weeks. Right, so what came out of those excruciating years of research was this sort of one sentence. It took me the longest time to come up. Sort of this, behind this, of course, sits this massive 200-page PhD thesis that had to be summarized in one sentence, and that goes like this. The theory of self-organizing Agile teams explains how Agile teams take on one or more informal, implicit, transient, and spontaneous roles and perform balanced practices while facing critical environmental factors. So 3 main categories, as you can see bolded out: the roles, the practices, and the factors. All right? And today, as I said, I'll be focusing on the roles. Again, a couple of papers that are devoted to explaining all about those roles, one in the IEEE Transactions and the other in the IEEE XC conference. All right, so as I said, I did not have these categories before I went in, so they emerged from talking to the people. So these are the informal roles I found people were playing on Agile teams that made them self-organizing. All right, so one of the first ones, and one of the probably the most sort of intuitive one, is the mentor role. The mentor role is the person who's guiding and supporting the team. They help them become confident in Agile methods, and they encourage continued adherence to the practices. So this is typically a Scrum Master introducing Agile to the team, whether they're from within the team or they're a consultant. There's somebody who's actually introducing the team to Agile. All right? So they were played by, in most cases, especially for newer teams, the Agile Coach. Agile Coach is a term that I use synonymously with Scrum Master or someone who's in charge of the process. Okay? In more mature teams, interestingly, right? Because I went and talked to a bunch of teams in different different experience levels. More mature teams, this was almost anybody. Okay? And what that meant was if a new member joined the team, just about anyone from the team could pay the mentor to them and get them sort of introduced to Agile. So it wasn't just the Agile coaches anymore. And their main idea was to interact with the team, and they're the most important, as you can tell, in the initial stages, right? So what I do is I bring some quotations from the actual interviews to give a sense of what people actually told me, right? So you can get a taste of what it's like. So this is a developer in New Zealand, and they're saying, with the mentor, and they would have mentioned somebody's name, it was kind of to teach us how Agile works and shape our mindsets and make sure everyone knows how to work under the Agile umbrella. All right, so that was their concept of this person helping them along their Agile journey. The Agile coach themselves in New Zealand said how they perceived their role as a mentor. You need to show them a client presentation that worked, and after a few such validation cycles, they start to get confident. Okay, so from the Agile coach's perspective, a lot of it was really getting them to, try it out. So once you've gone through your, say, 2-week iteration and you've got a concrete set of features to deliver and you demo it, in their experience, that validation was really strong to the team to be like, okay, you know what, this thing might actually work. Because they see the validation from the customers where they've developed something as a team. So that's the mentor role, as I said, is one of the most intuitive. People here have had experience of somebody being a mentor or playing a mentor themselves? Yes? Cool. So you would identify with that. The next one I found was the role of a coordinator. The idea here is that they represent the team. They coordinate with the customer. Okay, and they also coordinate change requests. Now again, all of these titles that I'm coming up with, mentor, coordinator, of course they're not carrying them on their business cards, right? They don't even know that they might be playing the coordinator role. So that's my job to figure it out after talking to so many people and looking at the patterns of data, right? And I get to label it, but it just exists anyway. You see what I'm saying? This is why they're informal. So in essence, they might have been a business analyst. That's what their title is. But on an agile team, they're playing a coordinator role. So this was played in new teams most often by the developer or the business analyst. And you will find it interesting, or intuitive rather, that the business analyst should do this, because most of the time, traditionally, coming from that background, they are the face of the team to the customer, aren't they? So it was only natural that once they became agile, they became the coordinator on behalf of the team with the customer. And this was for new teams. What I found in more mature teams, and this is teams that have been practicing Agile for 2 years, 5 years, and so on, everyone could play the coordinator role, right? You could just rock up to your client, talk about just about anything. And we all know those developers, right, who hide behind in siloed sort of cubicles, never wanting to see the customer's face, right? Do we know those developers, or we are those developers, right? There are people and there's personality issues, right? People don't wanna, like, I do my job, I'm a technical person, leave that, you know, just that's what I wanna do. Don't give me this people thingy. I don't wanna talk to people, I just wanna code, right? So we saw that transition for agile teams, starting off with the BAs, like, yo, go, you do the talking, I'll do the technical thingy, to over the years getting more and more comfortable to actually go ahead and just talk to the people and not just talk to code. So you see that transition happening. And again, the interesting thing here for me was that it existed despite the presence of the mentor. It wasn't that automatically it was always the mentor, the Scrum Master, the Agile Coach who was made the face of the team. No. In fact, they might also be assisting the coordinator, but almost always there was a developer or a BA involved in new teams.
Do you have an explanation for this evolution?
So the explanation is basically around, you know, the journey that they go through. So we're talking about, you know, two sort of ends of the continuum. One is where you started off in a traditional hierarchical setting, right? And somewhat stereotypically described, as I just did, about, you know, developers not wanting to talk to people. And the other end is the ideal self-organizing environment where everyone is doing this. And the explanation for me is the phases that you go through. And it's a process of evolution into becoming self-organizing, right?
Is there a manipulation that makes their life actually easier?
So the people who actually end up obviously doing this, and you'll see one of the roles towards the end about the people who don't adhere to it and what happens. So it's not like it works for everybody, right? So this is the story of the, you know, sort of people for whom it actually worked. So definitely that's a limitation. So had I talked to a lot of teams who tried Agile and failed, it would have been a different story. So this is based on where Agile actually worked for your team and what your journey was. So here's a senior manager in India saying, because we are working offshore, so this is a sort of a distributed environment, it's good to have one person who can communicate, like a coordinator. It talks to everybody. So in a distributed setting where your customer is sort of, you know, your team is in India, your customer is in Canada, it's logistically becomes a bit of a, you know, mess to have everyone in the team communicate with everyone on the other team. So oftentimes what they do is they nominate a few representatives on either side, and it makes life easier in the beginning. But again, as with mature teams, I saw almost everybody was talking to everybody. So yeah, there's no like one way. Here's a developer in New Zealand, and they said the coordinator still needs to get all the requirements to us. So wherever the business owner wants to make a change, we can plan a little bit ahead of time. So that was one of the things the coordinator was doing, was maintaining a work sort of pipeline as well. So just letting the team know, hey, this bit of stuff might be coming up. You better prepare for it. All right. The next role was translator. And this for me was really interesting because what I realized over this research was people speak different languages. The techie guys, seriously, I mean, it's all English, but it sounds like, you know, it's all technical jargon. And then there's the business people, the management, who are talking in business terms. right? How do you communicate in a way that everyone understands each other? That's really difficult, and Agile forces you to do that. You're no longer talking through specification documents. You have to talk face to face, and so you must talk each other's language, right? And so what I found here was that, again, this person would sort of, somebody in the team would take up that role, and someone who is probably naturally inclined to begin with, and later on you sort of get, trained into it. And so this was played by the business analyst, again for new teams, which is quite, obvious. But then later on, I found that most members were able to talk business to their business customers directly. And that today is one of the biggest sort of one of the most desired characteristics of developers is not just being an excellent technical person, but being a person who can talk to business people, right? And understand the requirements firsthand. So that was a translator role. Here's a product owner in New Zealand, and they said, my knowledge isn't as technical, right? So they're describing their sort of issues as a customer. They're like, look, I'm not really technical. Some things fell through the crack because we didn't have a good translator, right? So I was explaining all of this stuff I needed in my product from a business perspective, and the team was trying to understand at a technical level. There was no one to do the translation, and so some of the requirements just fell through the crack, okay? Here's a developer in New Zealand, and they're saying the terminology that the developers are using and the customers are using is very different. I think the translator has some value on the project. So what do people think? Have you had experience of feeling like you're speaking different languages at times? Yes?
Yeah, always.
Always. So, well.
In fact, we reached a point that we may suggest a solution
Uh-huh.
to the IT guys.
Right.
After that, if that solution doesn't deliver the requirements, then we're getting blamed for that.
Right.
Yeah, we suggest a solution because you did not deliver to us, or you did not suggest it to us.
That's right. Cool. So what do you think is one of the, have people got experience of sort of overcoming that problem?
I just think this is really funny. I think translator has some value.
Some value.
If you translate poorly, project will fail.
That's right.
There's no some.
There's a
I
lot.
won't say it's a crucial.
It's a lot.
But
Right.
some.
See, hey, I'm only the messenger, right?
I'm just commenting.
Exactly. No, I completely agree. It's one of those things that nobody really talks about, but it's there, and it needs to be acknowledged, the difference in language. Yep. Sorry, go back.
Maybe I'm ahead of myself here. Anything for architects?
For architects, oh, you're sort of peeping ahead.
Sorry.
That's okay. That's okay. Not specifically. Not in these set of roles, unfortunately. But there's a whole bunch of other observations that we can sort of talk about. All right. So one of the most important roles on an Agile team was that of a champion. Okay, and I bet you at least a few champions sitting in this room right now. So the idea is someone who champions the Agile team with senior management in the organization, the person who's sort of going to bell the cat, is going, let's do this, it's worth it, right? And they help sort of gain the support for the self-organizing team. Because oftentimes the developers, however brilliant they may be technically, they don't have the background or the guts or whatever you want to call it to walk up to senior management and go, let's try this new Agile thing out, right? So you need someone, literally, as I said, to bell the cat. And in this case, it was almost always played by the Agile coach and sometimes some dynamic developers who had good rapport with their senior management, all right? So they were able to actually go ahead and drop the idea. So this role was facing the senior management and wooing them pretty much for their support. So this is one of the quotations from a Scrum Trainer in India, and they say, the organizations I see getting the most benefit from Scrum are organizations where senior management really gets it. The least successful Agile adoptions are the ones where senior management has no interest in Agile, okay? So that tells you the importance of having senior management on your side, not just financially, not just backing it, all right, we're going to see how this works for 6 months, but actually understanding the value of Agile. And that's the job of the champion, to go and make them understand, look, this is worth it. It's not just a passing phase, it's here to stay, it's how the rest of the world is doing business. Let's do this. The next one is from a business analyst, and they said the champion was pretty much championing the whole Agile idea. Senior management were thinking of using the champion to expand Agile throughout the organization. So that again is not uncommon. You might start off with a pilot team. Hopefully they're successful, and once they are, the champion that was leading the pilot team is then made sort of the Agile director of change and process management across whatever you want to call it. But basically they lead the change to other teams in the organization if the senior management really backs the idea. All right? The next one was promoter, which is kind of similar, but the only difference here is that they're not really trying to woo the senior management, but more so the customer. Okay? So it promotes the Agile team with the customers, secures their involvement and support for the self-organizing team. Now, it'll be interesting to note what your experiences have been, because as far as the customer involvement is concerned in software development, it's not just the customer paying, a pot of money. For Agile, your everyday involvement becomes so important. So if they're not signed up 100%, you're going to have trouble doing Agile. Am I right? Or am I right? So that is the promoter's role. It's not to get new projects. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about convincing this customer to come to the release planning meeting, to take that extra time off to see the demo, to give the feedback. Because guess what? If you look at it from their perspective, it's a whole lot of extra work. It is. I mean, compared to what they used to do, they used to give a set of requirements, and hopefully it's all done fine, and at the end of it, you check it. That's not a lot of work as compared to what Agile demands of the customer. So if you want a customer that's truly involved, you need to convince them. Okay? And so that was played by the Agile Coach in all cases. All right? So here's an Agile Coach in New Zealand, and they said, I did persuade the client to go down this road, story cards, iterations, all the way through. Slowly the client did come around and started to see the benefits, so it really worked out quite well. Okay? So you sort of, lead them by the ear. Another Agile Coach, this time in India. We coaches have interactions with the customers, have a series of talks, explain to them what Agile is, focusing, interestingly, on the hardships. See what I'm talking about here? We're not just selling Agile. We're talking about, look, you're signing up for this. It's not going to be easy. It's going to require your time and your dedication, and that's what you need to know. All right, so the long term, the teams that were successful in the long term were the teams that talked about these hardships early on and had their customer on their side. All right, finally, one of my favorite, the Terminator, or as we call him lovingly, Arnold Schwarzenegger, Arnie. Terminates team members. This person exists, yes. They identify team members threatening the proper functioning and productivity of the team, and they engage senior management support in removing such person. And you're like, right, so people get fired all the time, that's normal. The interesting thing here is these people were not targeting developers or people who were not doing their technical job right. They were targeting people who were not in the right Agile mindset. So if you're bringing the team down because you just can't get out of the traditional way of working, and the whole team is being bogged down by you, right? You're given a few chances, you're given coachings, training, support, blah, 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 and if it didn't work, the final course or resort was to terminate them. So they were removed because they couldn't become Agile, right? Or they couldn't become self-organizing. So this was played by the Agile Coach in the new teams, and in more mature teams, the Agile Coach with input from the team. So the team would be like, look, it's been 3 sprints, we've been trying out with this person, he just doesn't engage, he's still, never tells us what he's doing in the daily stand-up meeting, he's still in his old ways of working, we're just being bogged down, we can't deal with it anymore. Oftentimes, yes, sometimes they were just removed, as in fired, But sometimes what they were the treatment was that they were transferred, if it was a large organization, to a non-agile team. Like, look, you're not happy here. This is not the right, it's like a plant, like indoor, outdoor thing. I put you outside. This is not the right conditions for you. You're not happy. Everyone else is unhappy. Let's put you where you belong. All right, so that's one of the ways. Another thing was to stop them from coming. So this sort of went into the recruitment side of things as well. More and more for new teams. Instead of having to remove them later, you sort of filter them out in the beginning, right? So more and more for agile teams, people are not just looking at technical capabilities, they're looking at your personal skills, your ability to be a translator, your ability to coordinate, your ability to talk to people in other than code, any language, right? So all of those soft skills becoming more and more important and becoming a way of filtering what goes into the agile team. Sorry, did you have a?
Yeah, I was just wondering how often did this happen? I mean, it happened enough that you created a role or not?
Right, that's a really good question. So the other ones were a lot more frequent. The reason this is a role by itself is not because it was as frequent as the others, but it was I find it really powerful, right? So it wasn't as frequent by any means. So there were a lot more mentors than there were terminators, right? Oftentimes the mentor would be the terminator if need be. So this is one of those fringe cases, but I think it's really pivotal to sort of creating the right team, and that's why it's a role by itself. All right, so here's a business analyst in New Zealand. This particular team member, so I've got lots of stories. This particular team member tore the whole product apart. So our Terminator noted that the team member was holding the team back and made an executive decision by talking to the management, got them removed from the team. The team started flying in no time. So they were really holding them back. Here's an Agile coach in India said, some evangelists have such 100% concept, just scares me as a coach. Throw out the evangelist sometimes. Hard reality, people get fired. Agile identifies the good things, Agile also identifies the bad things. So it's not just about people who cannot become Agile. Sometimes it's also about people who want to be a bit too, sort of fixated upon, we got to do it this way, right? This is the right way, there's no other way. Because you have to sort of adapt to your context. That's at least been my research sort of perspective and looking at sort of so many teams out there in the industry. Almost everyone contextualizes it. And the ones that are successful are the ones who contextualize Agile successfully. So by the book interpretations, I've found very, very few. It's almost always tweaked. So if you're not able to tweak, you sort of have to think about the big A Agile and the small A Agile. Are you really Agile? Right? All right, so in conclusion, self-organizing teams have existed in the past, as we saw in the beginning of this presentation, in various forms and shapes. I was introduced to the software industry by Agile software development. Following Agile practices does not automatically make your team self-organizing. You're sort of on your way. Thankfully, I'm not the only one running late. Yes! All right. You do have to have special characteristics like a high level of autonomy, ability to self-commit, self-select, self-track, self-accomplish things, right? Let them do it. And the roles that we talked about, of course, the mentor, coordinator, translator, all of these informal roles spontaneously formed around issues in teams, right? And supportive conditions enabled the team to self-organize and excel. So the role of the management in making all of this happen, extremely important. So it's just a small graphic to show you the power of self-organization. And thank you very much for your time. Cue eaten into your coffee break. Any questions? Yes?
The concept of self-organizing is in different perspectives.
Yep.
In energy management.
Okay.
Self-organizing systems, one of them, we have self-healing, self-diagnosis, self-management. I don't think we know, just start with self.
Self, yes.
So now,
Self-driving cars.
just on the quality determined systems, I'm interested in the roots of this. So self-organizing came from IT or management, the paper you mentioned.
Yep. So the earliest that we go back is the socio-technical systems. I'm not sure if you were here when we started. It was the English coal miners thingy. So that's the earliest that I could find in the 1950s. Study of English coal miners and how they performed as a cross-functional team of 10 to 15 people. That's one of the earliest references that I could find. In the 1950s. The paper was published in 1981, but the study was conducted around 1950s.
Because in the mind, they are disconnected from the world. There is no communication, and they have to. There's no.
That's a brilliant point.
Down there, and someone had to
The-
take on the roles as if they were in the real world. Because otherwise, they couldn't function in that type of environment.
That's an absolutely brilliant point. That might have been the case very much.
There was a real
I mean, the project manager is
Why is it coal miners? Because there was specific problem. because
exactly,
there was a real need.
and one of those scenarios where you want to direct remotely, you don't want to take the risk going yourself.
Yeah.
Yep.
The way I saw it, assume there's energy in any system, even software there's energy.
Yep.
And self-organizing, how to make the energy in the system.
You could look at it that way.